supremacy, it's black inferiority, and the abiding appetite amongst the black elite to function on the basis of white embrace. Number one. If we ourselves, even our thieves, are not patriotic, when they steal from Africa, they invest in Europe, they don't believe. The minister said, fix our own governance system. The people in charge of governance systems steal and invest elsewhere as an indictment or an affirmation of their own incompetence and incapacity. But the second bit is that I think both His Excellency Moussa Faki, Professor Lumumba, and the minister indicated, when you grow a disconnect between the people who give you legitimacy, who are the ultimate resource for the transformation of any nation, when you grow a disconnect between your culture, Amilcar Cabral said, every revolution is first a cultural revolution. A people must believe in themselves. That way they're able to produce both citizens and leaders who are not only patriotic and competent, but that are future-focused and that are regenerative. Unfortunately for us, we have constantly killed three forms of assets. First asset, we kill our babies and our young people by never exposing them. And Rwanda is an exception to this, to what it means to govern and what it means to negotiate, what it means to compete. Number two, in all our countries, anybody, the age group of the people sitting at this table, when you are out of government, you are finished. The state has absolutely no use of the experience, the expertise, and the resources. We are constantly going elsewhere to look for experts that we either have in the diaspora or we have in our countries. The inability to build, retain, use our own local expertise and experience. The third is that we have created everything to be so leader-centric that most of our citizens either wait for God or wait for the leader or wait for foreigners. And the day must come in Africa where Pan-Africanism is Pan-Africanism of the people. No matter how brilliant institutions are, continental or regional, as long as they are not nourished by the ideas of African intellectuals, African artists and activists. But there is hope. Many of you may not see it as hope. The dominance of Afrobeat and Afropop in the world today, sending a message, if that can be used as a vehicle of cultural regeneration, if what the young people have been able to do with tech can be used as a way of reimagining, then what we're talking about as a phenomenon will end. The third is that we can't keep sending all our people. I know that it may be brain gain for some people. We can't keep sending all our young people to Europe, to America, and elsewhere without creating pathways back. Why? Frantz Fanon said they realized that the empire or the center came and took the best from amongst us and took them to their best institutions, and they emptied them of their own culture and their own sense of being, and they filled them with ideas of how to be good Europeans and Americans. And when they returned, their kith and kin realized that their children had not come back. What had come back were echoes of the empire. You and I, having had the opportunities to serve outside our continent, when we return, we're not trying to establish little Europe's, little France, little America. There must be an authentic way. That's why Rwanda's revolution is not only leadership, it is homegrown solutions, not for Rwanda only, but for the whole world, not just for Africa. We cannot assert ourselves culturally, intellectually, spiritually, as long as we are leprous and dependent. We do not, and we have not controlled our mining sector. We do not, and we have not controlled our data and statistics. We do not, and have not controlled our education. We do not, and have not controlled our security, whether it's digital security or it's generic continental security, whether the threats are exogenous or indigenous. We do not and have not controlled our communication channels. This is something that's been realized since the inception of the African Union. And if you think about this, as we talk about unconstitutional changes of governments and other things, there are several things that are important as we reflect on foreign interference. State and nation building, how we transitioned to independence, and the Cold War and how it played out, the use of mercenaries, military coups, and capture and retention of power, and etc. In statistical terms, Chairperson, there were 200 coups in Africa between 1965 and 2012. In the 1960s, there was at least one coup every 60 days. In the 1970s, barely 18 years after Ghana's independence, at least 85% of African states had some coup experience or the other. And West Africa accounted for almost 44% of those. I mean the coups between 1958 and 2008. There was a temporary reprieve in the period post-1990. Some academics have suggested this because Africa had become more democratic. I want to disabuse you of that notion because it's lazy intellectualism. What had changed was that Western interest in a unipolar world, in changing regimes, had dissipated. The West no longer needed to use force. There was no competitor, either ideological or otherwise. What had essentially happened, there was dominance of one set of interests. So as we reflect on unconstitutional change of government, it's not just mere tinkering at the local level, but it's also what explains the ouster of Nkrumah, the assassination of Lumumba, the assassination of Sankara, the assassination of Amilcar Cabral, the assassination of Samora Machel, the ouster of Sékou Touré. What is the fact? That in a unipolar world, the appetite to change had dissipated. As we see greater polarization between the West, the East, and the Middle, we're going to see once again an intensification of interference. Less than 15% of that interference, Chair, will be justified as follows: protecting and promoting human rights or preventing genocide, protecting lives and property of citizens, fighting terrorism, violent extremism, or stopping some form of unproductive ideology. However, what we know, no intervention happens except it is in the interest and the propagation of the political, economic, social, cultural, racial, and other strategic interests of those who have power. But there are direct consequences, and have been for Africa, which are chaos and instability, retarded development, internationalization of conflicts, regional instability, destruction of cultural and other heritage, as we saw in Timbuktu, destruction of state institutions and public services, warlordism and violent extremism, as we've seen in the Horn and in the Sahel, collapse of the formal economy, and debt, poverty, and inequality, sexual and gender-based violence, and the pillage of our economies. Now, if we imagine in this framing that these are what we're dealing with, what are those channels of transmission? I want to suggest to you, Chair, that the first transmission of interference is an incompetent, corrupt, and ideologically unclear leadership. The second is a structure in the bureaucracy of government and administration that is beholden to the white gaze or to external gaze. Within the public administration, you harvest intelligence and you harvest division. The third is religion, as you rightly said. Religion, and it's not just Christianity. We have seen the competition for different sects of Islam in the Horn, in the Mediterranean. And it's not just religion, it's NGOs, international and national. Not just those, but churches as well. And I'm talking about these as institutions. But ultimately, Steve Biko described the vector of interference. He says the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. If you do not control what you educate, if you do not control what you communicate, if you do not control your narrative, you develop what we've seen, a disconnect between the leadership and the citizenry, a disconnect between the old and the young, a disconnect between the analog generation that has power and the virtual generation that is unemployed. A disconnect that is easy to exploit. The future of this intervention, Chair, data and the digital platforms will define the most potent weapon in interference. You do not need to do it physically, it will be done remotely. And lastly, Chair, I want to suggest to you, the second most potent is economic fragility. A people that cannot feed themselves, that depend on foreigners to feed them, will become slaves, either willingly or by force, until this continent assures its stomach infrastructure by its ability to feed itself, until this continent assures its mental infrastructure by the ability to think for itself and ideate. Then this continent will be thought for by others, fed by others. There's no liberty without these liberated intellectual zones and the ability to feed yourself. So interference happens because of our own inferiority and because of the supremacist views of others. My father told me a story of a man who was given a job as a janitor at the school. His job was to lock the gate every day at 6 p.m. And then some people in the neighborhood came and informally redistributed the fence. Some of you would say stole the fence of the school. This man faithfully locked the gate, but the fence had been stolen. And the purpose of locking the gate was to ensure safety. If the fence is stolen, put back the fence. So let me explain what this. A young Zimbabwean businessman called Busisa Moyo characterized the problem of Africa. He said, "We're not broke, we are broken." Right? And there is a difference. It's a very wealthy continent in terms of its human resource. When the United States decided to appoint a head for PEPFAR, they took away from my senior here, the chairperson of the African Union, his head of Africa CDC. They are Africans strategically, or black persons strategically heading very strategic institutions in the global north. Why am I saying this? My elder Ashraf asked me about narrative. There are 5 modes of narrative. First mode is action. That's what I think the chairperson of the African Union is saying, that people will not believe what we say until they see us act according to our beliefs. Pan-Africanism is not a theory. It's the lived solidarity that made the Ethiopians give Nelson Mandela a passport, that made Senegalese civil servants contribute $1 each every month for the liberation of South Africa, that made Zambia take care of us as Zimbabweans and South Africans as we fought for our liberation, that made Uganda take care of the comrades that now run this country. If Pan-Africanism has no active solidarity action, no active affirmative action, the words are meaningless, because even the devil can quote scripture. The second is dialogic. We have for too long used authority to govern our people and not dialogue. And in this respect, I must commend my colleagues and comrades here in Rwanda, because they are able to hold leadership meetings where citizens talk to leaders. I am hoping the African Union chairperson and the African Union Commission chairperson can actually convene with ECOSOC a conference each year of the citizens, not just NGO, a conference of the citizens drawn from the continent, and talk. Because often we only get to talk to our leaders in conferences in the United States and in Europe, and thought. There is no Pan-Africanism without doing what Mishera Mugo said: create liberated zones of Pan-Africanist thought. When we think, it's our European theorists who are thinking. When we speak, it's our American teachers who are speaking. It is okay to have gone to America to learn. It is okay to have gone to Asia to learn. But what is the influence of African intellectuals and thought on what the African Union does, on what our governments do, on what our civil society does? Number